Zach here, great, fantastic. Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to see so many people here in the room, and thanks to everyone who is joining us online from around the world. We're really excited to be here this morning for the launch of our new report, Strategic Change in U.S. Foreign Policy. This is a report that we have been working on for the last couple of years here as part of the American Statecraft Program. I'm Chris Chivvis. I direct the American Statecraft Program, and I'm a senior fellow here at the Carnegie Endowment. This report is really central to the mission of the American Statecraft Program because it's about how the United States can undertake significant change in its foreign policy. There are a growing number of analysts around Washington, D.C. who are calling for the United States to rethink its role in the world. And there are different views among those of us who think that the United States needs to do things a little bit differently than it has in the past. But there is a growing number of people who think that it would be good if the United States did a real rethink of what its role in the world is. But we have observed that it's one thing to think about different roles for the United States in the world, and it's another thing to actually implement change. And so we undertook this report in an effort to get at that question of what does it really take for the United States to change its role in the world. I think there's one fundamental puzzle that people have been talking about in foreign policy recently that illustrates the problem of change, and that is the pivot to Asia. We've seen a lot of debate over the course of really, by now, the last 10 years, about why the United States, 10 years after the Obama administration initially intended to announce the pivot to Asia, still has not really pivoted to Asia. And I think that's a question. There's a new book about it. It's increasingly discussed here in Washington, D.C. And I think the prevailing explanation or theory of why it's been so hard for the United States to pivot to Asia goes something like this. Well, the reality is the world is full of problems. There are problems in the Middle East, there are problems in Europe, there are problems in Africa, Latin America, and everywhere. And it's simply impossible for the United States to prioritize one region over another. And that US foreign policy makers in Washington, D.C. ought to just accept the fact that the United States is basically destined to have a deep engagement in each of the major regions of the world. Now, we take a different view in this book. Rather than, and it's not that we completely dismiss, of course, the realities of international politics and the way in which they draw the United States into the world. We look at questions of how the US foreign policy community reacts to these problems in the world. And we say another important piece of the puzzle here is how that foreign policy community in Washington, D.C., what you might call Washington, D.C.'s operating system for foreign policy, intakes these crises and these events that are happening around the world and outputs different types of policies. And we look in particular at the role of bureaucracies in resisting change in US foreign policy, the role of politics, and in particular Congress, in resisting change in US foreign policy. And we also look at interest groups and finally the psychology of change. Because the reality is that in many different contexts, if you look, for example, in the business sector, in other parts of public life, the psychology of change is always hard. Humans tend to resist change for many reasons. So what this report does is to explain how this operating system in Washington tends to resist change, why it tends to resist change, and what can be done reasonably, lawfully, acting within values that we all share, to actually bring about significant changes in US foreign policy. So we're here this morning to talk about this report and some of the more interesting findings that we've had. It's historically based, so I'm delighted to have my colleague, Stephen Wertheim, who is a historian of American foreign policy and also a co-author of the report, colleague in the Statecraft Program, to discuss it with me. Also thrilled to have Beth Sanner, who was the Deputy Director of National Intelligence, former President Trump's briefer, and now a commentator on CNN and a range of other organizations around Washington. And also Tom Dance, who is a visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation here in Washington, D.C., and was an appointed official in the Trump administration. We're hoping to talk not just about what's in the report, but we're also going to get to forward-looking questions about what kind of changes could we see, for example, in a Harris administration or in a Trump administration, and what kind of obstacles might changes in U.S. foreign policy, either under Harris or Trump, run into, and what's the thinking about ways in which those obstacles could or might not be overcome. So again, thanks to all of you for being here. And I think I want to hand it over to you, Stephen, maybe to talk a little bit, especially about the historical dimension of this. We have 5 case studies, which is a really rich foundation for the work that we do. And I hope everyone has the opportunity to read the case studies, because we wrote them in a way that we hope will be useful to people as sort of thumbnail sketches of major moments of change. But Stephen, I mean, you have some takeaways from those case studies that I think are worth sharing with everyone.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've studied U.S. foreign policy for many years, and I have to say I learned a lot from doing this report, because
so did I.
This is not what historians typically do when they go about their work. We tried to really focus on what would you want to know if you want to make strategic change in U.S. foreign policy, and we approached the cases then in a very targeted way and asked a similar set of questions about who supported the change, who opposed the change, and how did the proponents of change try to overcome the obstacles that they face. So a couple things emerged from the handful of cases that we looked at in U.S. foreign policy since 1945. And by the way, take a hard copy of the report. It's been so long in the making, I can't believe it's actually out. So
it's great to see. There's nothing like holding it, looking at it.
Somehow we wrote a report on strategic change, and I didn't expect on some level the report to actually come out when we knew that it was going to come out. So maybe I'm not the person to make strategic change if I can't anticipate the report coming out. So couple lessons. First was the importance of international crises to galvanizing change. International crises have often provided an impetus to make large-scale changes. That's, I think, in part because a crisis, perceived as a crisis, people think this should never have happened. This was unexpected. We have to revise our thinking, and we have to do something so that this kind of a thing doesn't happen again. It provides a sense of urgency as well that can force the bureaucracy and force the political system to be willing to make a difficult change. But the role of a crisis is never straightforward. In fact, most often crises have elevated preconceived ideas. They're not direct responses to the crisis. I mean, there's always an element of that. But large-scale strategic change is usually not implied by the objective nature of some crisis somewhere. It's already been thought about, and it's already been circulating with some degree of support among foreign policy professionals. So a clear example of that, which everyone is familiar with, is 9/11. Without 9/11, it's hard for me to see the United States engaging in something it called the global war on terror, with a series of large-scale interventions, including the invasion of Iraq. It is crucial to explaining the U.S. reaction to 9/11 that there had been a series of influential people that had high-level placements in the George W. Bush administration who wanted to promote regime change in Iraq, and who had a very expansive view of America's role in the world and a willingness to cast threats in a broad way rather than a narrowed way, because one response to 9/11 might have been to have a targeted set of military operations against the perpetrator of 9/11, Al-Qaeda, and that's very much not what the United States did. Ironically, neoconservatives had not, prior to 9/11, been all that focused on the threat of terrorism emanating from Afghanistan. But they did have a series of ideas that proved influential as the risk calculus of the Bush administration and Americans changed. And so those ideas could be redirected toward targets beyond the actual perpetrators of the 9/11 attack.
And so they sort of had with the point that you're making about that, I think is in the report about the neocons, is that they were there and they recognized the opportunity that 9/11 presented to implement a set of ideas that probably would not have otherwise been implemented.
I think that's right. Certainly not on the scale that they were,
Yeah.
and in the way that they were.
Yeah.
And they had, ideas related, maybe adjacent to the terrorist threat that had hit the United States in September 2001. So they had been concerned with threats emanating from the Middle East.
Yeah.
So they were well positioned, and the crisis gave them the opportunity to force changes through.
So what about, we also have a case study on Carter and the Carter administration. We have 5 case studies in this report, and the one on Carter is about failed strategic change, or the intent to carry out a major change in U.S. foreign policy that didn't work out. And I know that's one that you've thought about a lot.
That's right. So this one was interesting to me. I hadn't really registered previously how much Jimmy Carter, when he came into office, wanted to pull U.S. ground forces out of South Korea. This was, for him, motivated by a desire to avoid getting drawn into another land war in Asia in the wake of the Vietnam War. He also had human rights concerns about the South Korean government. So he was...
Remember, they were very authoritarian dictatorship
Exactly.
at this time. They are not the South Korea we have today.
Exactly. So, there was maybe a kind of general receptivity
Yeah.
to Carter's instinct. He campaigned on it. It wasn't just a private idea. It was a public idea. So you might think he gets into office, he says, look, I want to withdraw from South Korea, that he's the president, he's the commander-in-chief. He'd get his way, and that's not what happened. He didn't build much support within his bureaucracy. His idea threatened the mission and the incentives of the Army in particular, and the Army worked with members of Congress who wanted to block the withdrawal, and they did just that. And Carter was, within several years, grinded down and eventually scuttled his ambition altogether. He did not have a very self-conscious plan for dealing with the predictable opposition that would emerge from 2 places in particular, the bureaucracy in the executive branch and the Congress. And I think the general lesson then that we took away was, we think about the imperial presidency. There's a lot of concerns about the presidency becoming more imperial. And on foreign policy, the president is relatively less constrained than on domestic policy. That's all valid. But in fact, when it comes to making large-scale change in U.S. foreign policy, it takes more than a president. It takes, at a minimum, bureaucratic operators who are going to anticipate and manage the resistance to the change that's proposed. And I'll give you a successful case of strategic change, and that was the enlargement of NATO in the post-Cold War period that began under President Clinton. It was not obvious when Bill Clinton took office that an alliance designed to manage the Cold War would in fact start expanding, and it has expanded dramatically since then. And it was apparent to people that there were some real reasons not to expand NATO. The Pentagon was skeptical of taking on new defense commitments, especially as the defense budget was being cut to reap the post-Cold War peace dividend. And the Senate would have to approve any new members to NATO because it requires an amendment to the Washington Treaty. And the Clinton administration went about managing these problems in a very thoughtful way. First of all, even though advocates of expanding NATO beyond a partnership for peace idea lost the initial battle in the interagency process, they ended up going around that process. And a number of strong proponents who were well-placed in the administration worked together to try to get the president on board, to help put pro-expansion lines into his pieces, and then to turn around to the bureaucracy and say, so you see, this decision has been made, and now we need to figure out how to make the policy a success. The other thing is they actually, designed the very policy with the imperative to get Senate support in mind. So it's not like NATO was suddenly expanded to dozens of countries at first. Instead, they wanted to start small with 3 countries who were sympathetic cases, also had ethnic constituencies within the United States, making it a politically potent cause, Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary. And at the same time, they made it clear that this would not be the last round of NATO enlargement, that other countries would be next in line. And so the slogan at the time was, small is beautiful for that first round, plus robust open door. There will be more rounds. And the thought was, let's succeed with the first round, with the 3 countries. That will get people used to expanding NATO in the post-Cold War period. Russia is not going to have a dramatically bad reaction to that first round of enlargement. It's in no position to do so. And in fact, Russia acquiesced in that first round. And since then, there's been virtually no opposition to extending NATO membership within the US Senate to the many more countries who have joined, who are more debatable in terms of their defensibility and what they add to the NATO alliance. So, whether you think that policy was a wise policy or an unwise policy, I think you have to appreciate that it was a success in terms of strategic change.
It was a skillful policy when it comes to strategic change. So anyway, I hope that everybody takes a look at these case studies. We wrote them in a way that to try to make them accessible and informative, including for people who don't have the depth of knowledge that someone like Steve and other historians of American foreign policy do. But it's clear there are certain lessons here, right? I mean, one which you alluded to is that, it's almost as if an administration has to have a messaging plan, not just for the public, which is something that administrations hopefully think about when they come in, but also for the bureaucracy. You have to think about how to sell the change that you want to the bureaucracy, and I want to talk more about that in a minute. We also, you noted Congress as being particularly important in the Carter case. It's important really in all of these cases, though. And one of the things that really occurred to me in working on this was how important Congress is when it comes to major change in U.S. foreign policy. In a crisis situation, Congress doesn't matter a whole lot. The initiative is with the White House. The president and his or her cabinet are the ones who really make things happen. But if you're talking about significant shifts in America's role in the world, you're talking about budgets, you're talking about eliminating or creating agencies, things that are really in Congress's lane. So Congress acts more slowly, but if you want big change, you have to have the right, you have to sell the change also to Congress, and you have to end up with the right political constellation in Congress. In a divided government, it's obviously going to be much more difficult than if the president and Congress are in the control of the same party. I wanted to mention one thing, and then Beth, I want to bring you in here about the psychology of change, because this is something that is sort of runs through all of the cases that we do. And in the business literature on business management, there's a lot of discussion about sunk costs, which is very real, and it's recognized, I think, by by the management experts around the world, that sunk cost can be a big problem for a company that has invested a lot of time and energy into a particular product line or a particular effort. And actually getting a firm to back off of that is very hard. It's hard in the private sector. It's even harder in the public sector. And there are real reasons for this. I mean, people don't like to admit when they have made a mistake. And I think that there's just that basic human resistance to change. And sometimes admitting that you made a mistake can actually be detrimental to your career, right? And so in a situation in bureaucracies, but also in think tanks around Washington, D.C., I mean, admitting that a course of action that you have been pushing for has not turned out as well as you would like can be a dangerous thing. And so there's a political economy to it, and there's also a psychology to it that's difficult, that increases the overall resistance to change. Beth, so you have served in multiple administrations as an intelligence officer, including up to being one of the most senior intelligence officers in the intelligence community as former President Trump's briefer. I mean, you've observed efforts to change. I mean, how does this sound to you? I mean, what are the factors that you see that have impeded change in the administrations that you have served in?
Well, I'll pick up on sunk costs for a second, and then I'll be more general. But I remember I was in charge of South Asia analysis at the height of the Afghan war and the surge, and the decision about whether to surge or not. And I was driving home one day, and I had, I don't know, something was on, and it was an interview with this psychologist talking about sunk costs in a completely different environment. And I was like, oh, this is what's happening right here, is that it's not just about admitting you're wrong. It's about the fact that thousands of American soldiers have died. We've expended, by then billions of dollars. Are we going to actually say, no mas and walk away and leave all that? And people will accuse us of, was this fight in vain? I mean, there's real blood and treasure. There's humans. And there are the commanders of these soldiers who have called the moms and dads, who have greeted the caskets. So this is deeply psychological, and I love the focus of that in the piece. Okay, so I think one of the things I've really noticed, and I was lucky enough to serve under Brent Scowcroft, who is seen as the real master of how a National Security Council should be run, right? And maybe not everybody agrees, but it's kind of a thing in DC that he was a master of that. And the thing that I think he did really well was that he focused on strategy. He focused on big ideas, and then he delegated. And I was a junior staffer on the NSC. I was really way too young and over my head to be there, but I was trusted to go out.
But you were probably open to change, let me just say.
I was open to change, right?
Yeah.
But I was also just, here's the strategy. Go forth. And one of the points that you make in the book, in the manuscript, is this idea that at NSC, really the only power you have is the power to cajole, right? You have to convince other people throughout the whole government to follow this policy. And you can't order them to do that because you don't have the power to do that. And so really under Scowcroft, that was the thing. Like, if you said that the president was demanding this or Brent Scowcroft was demanding this as national security advisor, that was a very bad day for you. You were not supposed to do that. You were supposed to convince them that they believed in this policy. So it was a really different, I've never heard anybody really talk about that, but living that, it was clear, like, if you had to elevate a problem up the chain and Brent had to call over to DOD because they were misbehaving, you had failed. You had failed him, General Scowcroft. That was not a good day. So I really think that's this idea of, like, how do you get the bureaucracy from a pretty junior level, like me, holding counterparts who are more senior, but still, around the interagency to actually believe in this policy instead of just like ordering a top down. And the more you are an outsider in the milieu of Washington, the more that you are like Carter, like Trump, and you have ideas, you have a worldview that is quite different than how the bureaucracy has been thinking for a long time, and maybe how they thought about the world in school and in their jobs, and how they view themselves and their mission. You bring this out in the manuscript really well. Then you have real problems. If you don't take the time to actually bring everyone along, you will have friction. And sometimes that friction, I think the expectation for me would be you're sunk if you do not have it. And if you do not pick your cabinet members who share the same worldview, you will have kind of a cabal forming. And in a couple of these cases, like with Carter, there was like literally a cabal that formed who opposed what he was doing. That is absolutely what happened in some cases with President Trump having, some of his senior people just having a very different worldview.
I mean, I think it's this question of bureaucracy, and I'm sure you agree with me, Beth, that we should be clear that, not only do we have deep respect for all of the people who work in and serve in our bureaucracies, our National Security Administration, but also bureaucracy is essential to U.S. foreign policy. I mean, America's role in the world is extraordinarily complex, right? I mean, there's so many different processes you can't even begin to fathom it, and so you need these bureaucracies that insert routines and institutionalized processes in order for any kind of foreign policy to be implemented. They're absolutely critical, but they do resist change. It's in their nature.
They do, and one of the things that I found with intelligence officers, we're present at most deputy committee meetings, anything on national security, principal meeting, and me in the Oval Office. And if you do have cohesion and alignment, you might be the only person in the room who actually says, well, that's not going to go how you think it's going to go. Like, here's your goal. I'm not disputing your goal, not the intelligence officer's role, but you have to say, that's not going to go like that. And so I think it's very important, even when you have that cohesion, there is a bureaucracy, it might be at State Department, Defense Department, Intel community, that actually says, actually, that might not work, or it's more complicated. And so there is a very important role of saying those things.
Mm-hmm. So Tom, you were an appointed official in the Trump administration. I mean, is this how it appeared to those of you who were there also? I mean, that there was this sort of bureaucratic resistance, because we hear a lot about that. I mean, I don't know, is that the impression that you got?
Sure. And I'll come back to that. But first I want to thank you all for having me and Carnegie, and pleasure to meet Beth too. But I just want to share on Carnegie, for me, so the audience understands, this is kind of a long arc, because one of the longtime presidents of the corporation was one of my early mentors, Vartan Gregorian. For many years, ran the corporation in New York there. And in fact, he was my thesis advisor at Brown. I'm dating myself in the 80s, in the 80s, and we wrote a thesis together on the Basmachi revolt in Soviet Central Asia. So really in the weeds back then. So I know
that wasn't one of our case studies.
It's a long arc to come back here. I'm sure if God rest his soul, if he were alive today, he'd say, Tommy, which he called me, where the hell did I go wrong?
Well, we're delighted to have you, Tommy.
But it's a pleasure to be here. And so my career, I came in as a political appointee in Trump. So I was not involved in politics. However, I've been in the, call it the national security or foreign policy space, really in the private sector for most of my career. So I had Russian as a kid. I went to public school outside Baltimore. And something which we referred to then as the other government agency taught me Russian as a kid. Just my family, not Russian, but we spoke languages at home and studied in the Soviet Union, et cetera. Way goes on to way. that I execute these programs, venture capital programs in the former Soviet Union. And I'm coming to a point here, which is that different parts of the foreign policy apparatus and the execution part of it have different tendencies toward risk. So I was on the far end of this, which was the real risk-taking side, which we were betting our own money in furtherance of U.S. policy options. But I had to learn how to work with the foreign policy establishment. So that meant, I was in New York City. We watched the towers come down. I was there on 9/11. I was there in the rescue operation 2 days later. 2 months later, I was in Afghanistan as a private citizen because we own the largest dairy business in Kazakhstan, and I could get milk down to Badakhshan, Gordon Badakhshan, and I thought, well, hey, don't throw peanut butter packets out of C-130s. We can't give the milk away, but we'll bring it down there. So my point was, we had to learn the process of going to the Hill, meeting with congressional staffers. They told us, no, it's not that easy. You're going to have to back up and get in line with the existing foreign policy or come in line with the program. So we learned that. We ended up actually working at a real granular level, which is at USDA and their food 403B programs, and learning how to work with the bureaucracy. And what you came away with is it's a very complex system. It takes a tremendous understanding. There are major cross currents. There's huge inertia. It's like turning a battleship to make major change. But I think what we learned to get to your question, Chris, is like coming in the Trump administration, a lot of people didn't have that depth of experience. It was hard with the overlay. When I was there toward the end, it was COVID, so you didn't have the ability to interact with people as well. You didn't have the relations in place, and you had this, of course, there was an animosity. Well, I think it's fair to say that, or some difficulties in terms of personalities, et cetera. So doing big things without people having either an understanding or necessarily a patience level, with fraught with difficulty. But I think there's that over the last couple of years has increased the understanding. I think we're
That's
in a better
interesting.
place
So maybe it would. I guess one of the things about bureaucracy. One of the ways in which administrations over the course of the last several decades have tried to get bureaucracies to move in the direction that they want is obviously political appointments. All Republicans, Democrats, everyone does it. There's always a little bit of a debate about how far down into the bureaucracy do you politicize, and how many, for example, foreign service officers do you give political appointments to, so that you have that knowledge in the State Department, and that can have an effect up to a point. But the problem is that in a gigantic bureaucracy like the Defense Department, there are only so many people that you can put into positions who actually will be effective in those positions.
Correct.
So you can talk about replacing large amounts of the Defense Department, or the CIA, or the State Department. But the reality is that if you were to switch out a bunch of State Department or DoD employees with, say, people from Google or Boeing or whatever, they're not going to know how to run those agencies. The class knowledge is not going to be there, and everything is just going to sort of grind to a halt. Even if those people share the basic objectives of change or whatever the new policy may be, you're going to end up with incapacitating the U.S. Foreign Policy Administration in its ability to actually implement the change that you want to see. So I'm skeptical when people say, okay, well, you just replace a lot of these people. But I don't know. Beth, does that make sense to you?
Totally. I think that it takes usually. I've been in new jobs. When I went to NSC, I think it took me 2 years to understand how to do the job. Third year, I was like running all cylinders. And I think that, you go into a place that is as complex as DoD, there are only a few civil servants at a very high level that actually understand the entire thing.
How to make that place work, yeah.
It is hard, and it's why, many deputy secretaries of defense have gone in there and tried to do things and have failed because the bureaucracy will fight you back. And in DoD's situation, the military will just take a greater and greater role. And that certainly is where we are right now, is the military has a greater role at DoD than, 20 years ago, for sure, where civil servants were a stronger force. So the ability to change, I think people are really missing the point when they go in and they just try to put their people in and force things into the system. I really believe that you can talk about policies and find something to make people want to do things. This is just basic change management. It's how you convince your teacher to give you an extension. It's how you work a group project. It's how you incorporate change in a corporation. If you just tell people, it does not work, and I know because I've tried.
Tom, what do you
Doesn't
think
work.
about that? I mean, there is some discussion about potentially replacing large numbers of people.
Yeah.
I mean, is that something that, what do you think about it?
Well, I think probably picking up on that last point is like, this is you have to be a salesman, number one, as Beth talking about. You have to address all these different constituencies. Chapter 7, I don't mean to read the whole book, but chapter 7 is great. It lays it out.
Of our report, Strategic Change in U.S. Foreign Policy.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Right, okay.
So like
The whole
it lays it out constituency by constituency and the issues, and found it tremendously enlightening. So, I mean, think about all these. So I'm saying you have to be a salesman first on this. And to Beth's idea about the theory of the firm, I think important thing to realize in, as they say in DC, there's no limit to what you can accomplish here if you're willing to give other people the credit. So and the theory of the firm, basically, to follow that analogy is, yeah, it is like a business. You have a operations department, you got an HR department, you have a planning department, but by far the largest department is the credit department in Washington. So everybody wants credit. Your idea is your challenge is to convince them that the idea was theirs when it works, and then to let them have some deniability when it doesn't. But to earn their respect and their participation, that they'll either help you or they'll stand back and not get in your way. So not everybody can be cajoled or brought into that, but you have to be able to work that. And look, I want to be clear about the bureaucracy. There are very dedicated people out there that give their lives and careers to furthering the mission. So it's a team. This is a team sport, and basically, like, so I technically served in the Biden administration too. I'll tell you, so I was in there, I was a term commissioner of something called the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, which is actually an independent agency that advises both the president and Congress on our Arctic strategy writ large. So I was there for about 9 months, and basically we got moved out. But the continuity, and that's a good example of an area where I think you have a very broad overlay between what the left and the right view as our national interest in the Arctic, and we can find ways to work together. So my plan there was to try and convince the folks on the Biden administration, NSC level, that, hey, these ideas are the ones that you want too, right? And let me help you execute. I'm not there anymore, but I can show you what we set up, and hopefully you'll embrace it, and for the good of the country or so.
So I want to pose a question here, though, because I think we've been talking about how to go about making a change that the administration at top levels wants to make. When I think about, let's say, a potential Trump administration coming in 2025, suppose they realize all the ambitions to be able to control the bureaucracy. Maybe that's through appointments of loyalists to President Trump. Maybe that's through changing the incentives of the bureaucracy. But suppose that problem that we've just been discussing goes away completely, which will not happen.
Right.
What actual strategic change do those loyalists to President Trump want to make? And they are very much divided from where I sit on the substance of how they want to change U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah.
Take the war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Take Europe.
Yep.
The median position maybe on the U.S. role in European security is that the U.S. should promote burden sharing. It should try to get European allies to step up, but that there are positions that are more radical and say, well, this is really Europe's job to secure itself. The United States should be taking a serious step back from European security, maybe hollowing out NATO, maybe even leaving NATO. And there are others who are Russia hawks. All these people, I think, are potentially loyalists to President Trump, and President Trump himself makes different noises, at different times.
Right.
So it's going to take a resolution to make strategic change and to even have to figure out, what do I need to sell to the bureaucracy? It's going to take a resolution, a decisive resolution of those questions first. And at a minimum, I don't see those questions being resolved without at least some serious review and internal battles, for at least a year.
Yeah, and I think Asia is exactly the same way. I think, the question of how much for Taiwan, what's our role, ultimately what do we want to do, what should be the presence of US forces in Asia, that, given what President Trump wanted in the last term and what a lot of potential members of administration are saying now, are very much 180. The Middle East. He fired John Bolton because he was too hawkish in terms of his anti-Iran position. Other things as well, but that was a key factor. And so, these divisions, I think that, one of the things I think is so important about how you run, how you serve as a leader of anything, is clarity on what you want, right? And this clarity of what is our strategy, what is our goal, how do we follow through, and then roles and responsibilities of who's going to go out of the box. So you hear these kind of stories about discussions where, people having disagreements in front of presidents, which I think is very positive. But then at the end of that, you don't just let that hang. You actually have to pick and then stick with it and push it forward. And so I think it's very hard in these complex situations where the right answer isn't obvious, right? Yeah. It's hard.
But maybe let's focus a little bit on what another Trump administration would do with regard to Europe. This is one issue that, like many people, I follow fairly closely, and I've observed among European interlocutors a sort of they have a very definite view of what's going to happen. Trump will withdraw he'll do some kind of a deal on Ukraine, and then basically withdraw from NATO. And I have spent some time saying, well, I'm not sure it's as set in stone as that. I mean, those things could happen, and I think that's important to acknowledge, and you should be prepared for that. But at the same time, I wouldn't assume that they're necessarily going to happen. So actually, Tom, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. I mean,
sure. And, important caveat, I don't work for the campaign. The president's been very clear on who speaks for him, and that's him and his campaign. So, and I don't necessarily speak for Heritage Foundation. I'm a visiting fellow there. So important caveats there, but I can talk to you from my view as a original Trumper, if you want to call us that. I literally am escalator class. So when he came down, it was like, I was a pecan grower. I was growing thousands of acres of pecans at that time. I said, okay, I'm in here. So I was knocking doors in Butler, Pennsylvania in 2016. I was at the rally in 2020 there. I was the #2 international official at U.S. Treasury. I was parking cars in a cow pasture that afternoon. So, but that's where I come. I'm from South Texas. I was growing pecans literally on the Rio Grande. When you see those pictures, I think people are now familiar with Eagle Pass, right? So those pictures are orchards. Those are pecan orchards there. And I won't get too far in the weeds, but that's some of the best pecans in the whole world. Just important to understand that. But when you farm out there, and you're on the river, you're on Telcel. You're in Mexico time, so it's a different appreciation of where we stand in the world. But in terms of what could be in the future, where I tell people is, look at Agenda 47, right? The president put out 20 points. That is his priorities. And if you want to understand what's going to affect Europe, look at each of those issue items. Actually, you probably don't get to number 8 on the list before you have a direct intersection with Europe. And that's basically avoid World War III, I think, is where it starts. So, you can construe that however you might, but he's been clear about trying to end the killing, end the death in that conflict in Ukraine, Russia. How it sorts out is complex, right? There's multifaceted. But then look at if you're concerned about NATO, look at, I think it's number 13, it's make the U.S. military stronger than ever, right? So, hey, if I'm in NATO and I'm North Macedonia, well, it's not bad, right? Because I'm part of that same Article 5 power, right? I think where you can see other strands there are, the focus where it gets complicated is number 2 is the deportation, right? So that has much more of our hemisphere. There's a focus coming back to Mexico as a major, our number 1 trade partner, or number 2, whoever, depending on how you're counting. But then there's also issues in countries. You heard him talk. I don't know how many people listened to all his speeches, but in Grand Rapids the other day, he had some comments on El Salvador. But you can look at things like Nicaragua, right? I mean, little thorns on our side. We've had probably 10% of the Nicaraguan population move to the U.S. in the last couple of years, last 2-3 years. So we have a huge community here, right? And and yet you have Managua setting up diplomatic relations with Burkina Faso and bringing charter flights in from Africa and beaming these people. So that's where the administration begins to sort out some of these things, which might not be, they might not seem like front table issues, but they're going to get solved. Another example, Russia, right? That's a biggie. Everybody wants to project things about the U.S. being an Atlantic country. Well, true, that's very important, but we're also a Pacific country, right? So we're an Arctic nation. We actually have the world's longest maritime boundary with the Russian Federation. That's important to us, right? Russia has set up what's going to be an energy Congo line of crude. They're sailing it around right past Alaska. We don't have response vessels. We don't have a way to even maintain presence. Those are international waterways above Russia, right? But if you don't have I'm sorry, I'm going to digress here. I'll talk all day about icebreakers if you let me. But my point is, think about it. If you you have to put an overlay of America first and ask yourself, how does this affect Americans? The expression, does it play in Peoria? That's the old expression, right? You have to say, hey, is it useful in Uvalde? Type of thing. I think that's how I would say.
Sure, and we could get into icebreakers, but we won't go there. I actually have my own views on the icebreakers. But okay, so that's very helpful to think about. There may be more openness in terms of, at least on some areas, in terms of what a Trump administration would do, for example, with Europe. Obviously, we also have, potential Harris administration, and one of the things that people have talked about in the last couple of days is whether or not a President Harris would take a different approach to the Israel-Hamas conflict than the Biden administration has. I mean, one of the things that interests me about the Biden administration on the question of strategic change is that they came into office with the idea that they were going to right-size America's role in the Middle East. And I think that that's the right attitude to have. America's interests in the Middle East are there, but they are declining. And there's a little bit of a mismatch between the degree of our commitment and the level of our interest, certainly when you look out in terms of the trajectory. But in any event, despite this intent to right-size America's role in the Middle East, they are leaving, well, President Biden at least is leaving, with what is arguably a deeper commitment and the potential for an even deeper commitment with a potential treaty with Saudi Arabia. So it's a perfect example of how difficult strategic change is. So the question is, okay, so say if there were a Harris administration, what are the chances that she would aim to pursue a different kind of an approach to Israel-Hamas, even a different kind of a relationship with Israel, and what kind of obstacles might she run into? Beth, do you have thoughts on that?
When you look at that deal with Saudi Arabia that the Biden administration is trying to put forward to set in motion a path to a two-state solution. But basically, the idea behind this is it started in the Trump administration with the Abraham Accords, and then the Biden administration picked that up, gave Trump administration credit, and continued to move that forward. But the whole idea of it is to empower a more collaborative Middle East so that they can create stability there, right? So there's
To
strategic
balance against Iran. I mean, that's the...
against Iran. So here's the rub, right? So the Biden administration wanted to push that through, and a lot of Republicans, or the Saudis, wanted the Biden administration to put that through because to get congressional approval, you almost needed a Nixon to China moment. You needed a Biden Democratic proposal to pass because otherwise you wouldn't get the Democrats to vote for it. And so that kind of constraint, I think, really underlines the issue with Harris in a next administration. Who's going to control the Senate? Right. What is all that going to be about? But also internally to the party, Harris represents, she's a little bit more center-left, more left of center than Biden is on the whole Middle East thing, right? And so this is seen as a strength, that she can talk about the Palestinian question, she can call for a ceasefire. I think this administration has used her as kind of an internal counterpoint to make those points on purpose, to, try to heal this divide, or at least provide a bridge to the left, and so they wouldn't lose all the left votes. But I do think it's kind of in her DNA. She doesn't have the experience with the Middle East. She has much more experience on human rights. She, put forward the Uyghur Human Rights Act and the Hong Kong penalties against, anti-democratic behavior there. So she has a really strong human rights record. I think she's going to run full steam if she pursues that into very practical things in U.S. politics and inside the Democratic Party, the divisions there in terms of the long-standing support for Israel, and what are we going to do with Iran? And the Iranian question is going to get harder because of Russia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? So 2 years from now, what if they have, the latest fighter jets, or at least better than the 1970s jets from us that they have?
Well, it's a what if, but certainly it could be a challenge in a couple of years.
It's a huge possibility.
Yeah.
It's much more likely that they're going to get, air defenses, that they don't have modern air defenses, and more capabilities to be an offensive threat in the Middle East from the Russia threat. More so, I think, than the nuclear side. So what do you do with a regional hegemon? Reality is going to hit us again. The Houthis, the effort to deter the Houthis has completely failed because we have constrained rules of engagement, and they're really hard to constrain because they don't mind being hit. So I just think that the Middle East and this idea, it's like the adversary gets a vote, and as this is what I think is the main problem with disengaging with the Middle East. What do? We decide, are we no longer the country that protects freedom of navigation? That would be a big strategic shift. Stephen would say, yes, we should do that. We should stop being the only ones to do that. I kind of agree. The Bush administration, when they did the protecting the waterways in the Persian Gulf, they made the countries involved pay. That's a very Trumpian idea.
Stephen,
but it happened before.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Stephen, what do you think? Do you have any sense of whether, it's very early to make these kinds of predictions, but people are doing it, so why not you?
I actually think freedom of navigation is one of our clearer interests in the region.
I'm sorry to tar you.
But I think, there are first, more than strategic problems, political problems with letting go of the set of objectives that the United States has associated itself with in the region.
Domestic political.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I think too. I think it's hugely a domestic political problem.
I think, so I don't know. We don't have a whole lot of evidence about how a President Harris would view these questions. I think one thing I would look for is, what does she think the politics of U.S. foreign policy are?
Right.
Does she read it as, you know, you really get punished if you're a president and you put too much emphasis on diplomacy, or you withdraw U.S. military forces or shrink commitments, and then bad things happen? What did she learn from the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was an important experience for members of the Biden administration? At the end of the day, I think the Biden administration, despite coming in looking to right-size the U.S. military posture in the Middle East, decided that, in part, it didn't want to pay the political costs of doing that. Also, I think the Biden administration had real questions about whether it wanted a clean reentry into the nuclear agreement with Iran. So how does Harris read that? We'll have to see. She's clearly of a different generation than President Biden was, and that will probably matter. She'll be, perhaps, especially on Israel-Palestine issues, more responsive to the Democratic Party as a whole, as opposed to one portion of the party. But as we've discussed, really hard to change U.S. foreign policy in big ways. And the president will need to be willing, at the end of the day, to take political risks.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's true, we've been talking a lot about how hard it is to change U.S. foreign policy and America's role in the world. But of course, one of the messages of the report is it has happened since the end of the Cold War. Big changes are possible, but you have to have the right conditions and you have to have the right approach. So I hope everyone gets a chance to read the report. We're always delighted to have feedback. We often get it from folks, and we cherish it. Tom, Beth, great to have you here. Stephen, wonderful to be able to work on this report with you in the American Statecraft Program. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you at Carnegie sometime again in the future.